There is a distinct chilling terror that comes when red and blue lights pierce the rearview mirror of a $1 million supercar. It's supposed to be a routine traffic stop. But when a prejudiced rookie cop decides the black man behind the wheel of a matte black Lamborghini Revuelto couldn't possibly own it, a routine stop transforms into a spectacular collision of arrogance and absolute power. What Officer Bradley Carter didn't know was that the man he was violently dragging out of the driver's seat wasn't a car thief. He was the Honorable Chief Judge Alexander Smith of the Federal District Court, and Carter had just ignited a $10 million inferno that would burn his career, his finances, and his entire life to the absolute ground. The autumn wind off Lake Michigan carried a biting chill, but inside the cabin of the 2024 Lamborghini Revuelto, the climate was a perfect climate-controlled 72 degrees. Alexander Smith gripped the Alcantara steering wheel, letting the deep, resonant purr of the naturally aspirated V12 engine massage away the crushing fatigue of the past 72 hours. At 58 years old, Alexander was a man who had built his life on precision, intellect, and an unshakable respect for the law. He had graduated at the top of his class at Yale Law, spent 15 years as a ruthless but fair federal prosecutor, and now sat as the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. He was a titan in the legal world, a man whose signature could freeze billions in corporate assets or send cartel bosses to maximum security prisons for the rest of their natural lives. But tonight, Alexander didn't look like a titan. He looked like a tired man who just wanted to go home. Having just concluded a grueling week-long deliberation on a massive corporate embezzlement trial, Alexander had shed his heavy black robes, his tailored Brooks Brothers suit, and his silk tie the moment he reached his private chambers. He was currently wearing a faded gray Yale pullover, loose black sweatpants, and a pair of worn-in running shoes. He was a black man in a hoodie driving a supercar worth north of $600,000 through the affluent, heavily manicured streets of Oak Brook, Illinois. 2 miles away, sitting in the darkened cab of a Dodge Charger patrol cruiser, Officer Bradley Carter was having a slow, frustrating night. Carter was 26, a former high school linebacker who had joined the force 3 years prior with a chip on his shoulder and a deeply ingrained belief that he was the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. He had already racked up 4 civilian complaints for excessive force and discourtesy, all quietly swept under the rug by a benevolent union representative. Carter viewed the wealthy suburbs not as a community to protect, but as a hunting ground where he could exert dominance. As Alexander's matte black Lamborghini glided past Carter's hidden speed trap, the radar gun didn't even beep. Alexander was doing exactly 35 miles per hour in the 35 zone. He was a judge. He didn't break the law, not even traffic ordinances. But Carter's eyes narrowed. The streetlights illuminated the driver's seat just enough for the officer to see the silhouette of the man behind the wheel. A black man, in a hoodie, driving a brand-new exotic Italian hypercar in one of the richest zip codes in the Midwest. Carter's radio crackled. "Dispatch, this is Unit 42. Running a plate on a suspicious vehicle. Mighty Black Lamborghini, Illinois. Tags." "Copy, Unit 42, the dispatcher replied a moment later. "Tags come back to us Smith Holdings, LLC. No wants, no warrants. Vehicle is legally registered and insured." The rational response would have been to let the car go. But Carter prejudice was a loud, demanding voice in his head. Smith Holdings, LLC. To Carter, that sounded like a shell company. It sounded like a drug dealer trying to hide his assets. It sounded like a stolen car with fake plates. There was absolutely no way the man driving that car owned it legally. Carter slammed his foot onto the accelerator. The Dodge Charger surged out of its hiding spot, tires squealing against the cold asphalt. He closed the distance in seconds, tailgating the Lamborghini aggressively before violently flipping on his light bar and sirens. Inside the Revuelto, Alexander saw the explosion of red and blue in his mirrors. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. He checked his speedometer, still exactly 35. He checked his turn signals, his mirrors. He had done absolutely nothing wrong. But as a black man in America, Alexander knew all too well that doing nothing wrong was rarely a shield against the flashing lights of a police cruiser. With practiced, deliberate movements, Alexander activated his right turn signal, smoothly pulled the Lamborghini onto the well-lit shoulder of the suburban avenue, shifted the massive transmission into park, and turned off the engine. He rolled down the driver's side window, placed both of his hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, and waited. He watched in his side mirror as Carter practically leaped out of the cruiser. The officer didn't approach cautiously. He marched forward with an aggressive, chest-puffed swagger, his right hand resting ominously on the butt of his holstered Glock. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." Carter barked, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet suburban night. Alexander did not flinch. "My hands are on the wheel, officer. How can I help you this evening?" Carter reached the window, shining his heavy maglite flashlight directly into Alexander's eyes, blinding him. "Don't play games with me. Whose car is this?" "It is my car, officer," Alexander replied, his voice a calm, deep baritone. It was the same voice that silenced crowded courtrooms, but Carter was too blinded by his own assumptions to hear the authority in it. "Right, your car," Carter sneered, the sarcasm dripping from his words. "Just taking the $500,000 spaceship out for a joyride in your pajamas. Hand over your license, registration, and proof of insurance. Now, I am happy to provide my documentation," Alexander said, his tone remaining perfectly level. "My wallet is in my right back pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I will need to move my hands to retrieve them. Do I have your permission to do so?" Slowly, Carter snapped, shining the light harsher into Alexander's face. "You make one sudden move, and we're going to have a serious problem." Alexander slowly reached into his pocket, retrieved his leather wallet, and extracted his Illinois driver's license. He handed it through the window. It read, "Alexander James Smith." It did not say judge. It did not list his credentials. It was just a standard state ID. Carter snatched the card, barely looking at it before glaring back down at Alexander. "Okay, Alexander, where'd you steal it from?" Alexander's jaw tightened. The air in the car suddenly felt very still. "Excuse me? You heard me!" Carter leaned in, his face inches from the window, his breath smelling of stale coffee and peppermint. "A guy like you doesn't drive a car like this. So I'm going to ask you one more time before things get ugly. Whose car is this, and how did you get the keys?" The audacity of the question hung in the cold night air. Alexander Smith had spent his entire adult life navigating the complex, often prejudiced corridors of the American justice system. But the sheer, unvarnished profiling happening right in front of him was staggering. "Officer," Alexander began, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the precise, measured cadence he used when dressing down an unprepared defense attorney. "I have provided you with my identification. The vehicle is registered to my holding company, which matches my legal surname. I was driving the speed limit. I have committed no traffic violations. I suggest you run my license, verify my registration, and allow me to proceed to my home." Carter let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You don't give the orders here, pal." "I do, and right now I have probable cause to believe this vehicle is stolen." "On what grounds?" Alexander demanded, his legal mind snapping into high gear. "You have no reports of the stolen Lamborghini Revuelto in this district. You have no wants or warrants attached to the plates. Your probable cause is entirely fabricated, based solely on your personal assessment of my appearance. That is a clear violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." Carter's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. Cops like Carter hated nothing more than a civilian who knew their rights. And they especially hated a black civilian who spoke to them with unflinching authority. "Step out of the vehicle," Carter ordered, his hand gripping his radio. "Now." I am not required to exit the vehicle for a standard traffic. I said, step out of the damn car. Carter roared, entirely abandoning protocol. Before Alexander could unbuckle his seatbelt, Carter reached through the open window, yanked the interior door handle, and hauled the heavy scissor-style door upward. Carter grabbed Alexander by the shoulder of his Yale hoodie, attempting to physically drag the 58-year-old man out of the low-slung bucket seat. "Remove your hands from me immediately," Alexander warned, his voice like cracking ice. He complied with the physical force only to prevent an escalation that could end with him getting shot, stepping out onto the asphalt. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof," Carter shouted, spinning Alexander roughly around and slamming him chest first against the matte black carbon fiber of the Lamborghini. Alexander winced as his ribs hit the hard surface, but he kept his hands visible, placing them flat on the roof. "Officer, I am formally advising you that you are making an unlawful arrest. You are operating outside the bounds of your authority, and you are actively committing assault and battery under the color of law." "Shut up," Carter spat, violently kicking Alexander's legs apart. He unclipped his handcuffs, the metallic rattle sounding deafening in the quiet street. He grabbed Alexander's left wrist, wrenching it behind his back, and clamped the cold steel around his skin, ratcheting it down far too tight. He repeated the motion with the right wrist. "Is Matchech Unit 42, Carter breathed heavily into his shoulder mic. "I have one suspect detained. Send me a backup unit. I've got a grand theft auto and resisting arrest." "Copy, Unit 42. Basibek is en route," the radio crackled. Alexander stood there, handcuffed, his face pressed near the roof of his own car. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, stabilizing breath. He did not fight back. He did not yell. He was a master chess player, and Carter had just recklessly knocked over the board. Alexander was already documenting every single second of the encounter in his mind. Time of stop, 10:14 p.m. Lack of probable cause. Unlawful extraction from the vehicle. Excessive force. False imprisonment. Defamation. The list of civil rights violations was growing by the second. "You think you're pretty smart using big legal words," Carter mocked, conducting an aggressive, humiliating pat-down of Alexander's pockets, tossing his phone and keys onto the hood of the car. "I see guys like you every day. Think you can scam the system. Drive through my town in a stolen exotic, acting like you own the place." "I do own the place, officer," Alexander said quietly. "I live half a mile from here, in the gated community of Oakwood Estates." "Yeah, right, and I'm the mayor of Chicago," Carter scoffed. He grabbed Alexander by the bicep and shoved him toward the back of the patrol car. "You're going to sit in the back of my cruiser until we figure out who this car really belongs to, and then you're going to county lockup." Carter opened the back door of the Charger and forced Alexander inside, slamming the door shut. Sitting in the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the police cruiser, his wrists aching from the tight steel cuffs, Alexander looked out the window. A few cars drove by, slowing down to stare at the spectacle of a black man in handcuffs, a cop, and a Lamborghini. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but beneath the humiliation, a cold, terrifying anger was solidifying within Alexander Smith. This officer had not just crossed a line, he had leaped over it with malicious intent, and Alexander was going to ensure that the justice system, his justice system, would rain down upon Bradley Carter with the force of a biblical flood. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder. Carter requested backup was arriving. 2 more patrol cars screeched onto the shoulder, their strobing lights turning the suburban street into a chaotic disco of red, blue, and blinding white. 4 officers jumped out, hands on their belts, rushing toward Carter, who was standing proudly by the Lamborghini, admiring his catch. Among the arriving officers was Sergeant David Harrison, a 20-year veteran of the force. Harrison was a no-nonsense, meticulous cop who had survived 2 decades in law enforcement by strictly following the book and treating the community with respect. He had been a key witness in several federal racketeering cases over the years, spending countless hours in federal courthouses. Harrison walked up to Carter, his eyes scanning the scene. Talk to me, Carter. Dispatch said Grand Theft Auto and resisting. Carter puffed out his chest, pointing a thumb back at his cruiser. Yeah, Sarge. Caught this guy driving a $500,000 Lambo. Refused to answer questions, started getting combative and throwing legal jargon at me. Ran the plates, it's registered to some shady holding company. Typical shell game. I got him secured in the back. Harrison frowned, looking at the pristine Lamborghini. A holding company. Did you verify the name on his license against the holding company's records? Not it. License says Alexander Smith, Carter replied dismissively. Company is Smith Holdings. Look at the guy, Sarge. He's in sweatpants. There's no way he's the legitimate owner. It's obviously stolen identity or fraud. Harrison's blood suddenly ran ice cold. He stopped dead in his tracks. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Alexander Smith, what did you just say? Harrison asked, his voice suddenly dropping to a hoarse whisper. I said he's probably using stolen identity. No, the name, Carter. What name is on that license? Alexander James Smith, Carter repeated, suddenly looking confused by his sergeant's pale face. Harrison didn't say another word. He practically sprinted past Carter, shoving the younger officer out of the way, and marched toward Carter's patrol cruiser. He grabbed his flashlight, ticked it on, and peered through the heavily tinted back window. The beam of light illuminated the man sitting in the back seat, the man in the gray Yale hoodie, the man looking back at him with an expression of absolute terrifying calm. Harrison felt his stomach drop into his boots. It was a face he had seen dozens of times from the witness stand. It was the face of the man who had single-handedly dismantled the Chicago West Side Syndicate from the bench just 3 years ago. Harrison wrenched the back door of the cruiser open. He didn't speak immediately. His brain was desperately trying to process the magnitude of the disaster that his rookie officer had just created. Good evening, Sergeant Harrison, Alexander said from the back seat, his voice perfectly even. It has been a while since the Moretti trial. How is your wife doing? Harrison swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly bone dry. She's well, Your Honor. My God, Your Honor, I cannot apologize enough. Harrison reached in, his hands visibly shaking, and grabbed Alexander's arm to help him slide out of the cramped back seat. Turn around, please, Your Honor. Let me get these off you immediately. Carter, who had walked up behind Harrison, stopped in his tracks. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of total confusion. Sarge? What are you doing? Why are you calling him Your Honor? Harrison didn't look at Carter. He was too busy frantically digging his master cuff key out of his pocket. He jammed it into the handcuffs on Alexander's wrists, unlocking them with a loud clack. Alexander pulled his arms forward, rubbing his raw, red wrists slowly. He stepped fully out of the cruiser, towering over Harrison and the now frozen Carter. Carter, Harrison said, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and white-hot rage. He finally turned to look at the rookie. Do you have any earthly idea what you have just done? I pulled over a suspect. Carter stammered, his confidence evaporating as he looked between the sergeant and the black man in the hoodie. You didn't pull over a suspect, you absolute imbecile, Harrison hissed, stepping toward Carter. You just violently arrested, assaulted, and falsely imprisoned the Chief Judge of the United States Federal Court for the Northern District. The words hung in the air. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the police cruiser engines. Carter's face drained of all color. He looked at Alexander, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. The legal jargon, the holding company, the absolute lack of fear. It all clicked into place, and Carter felt his knees go weak. Alexander stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply looked down at Carter with the cold, detached scrutiny of a predator observing its prey. Officer Carter, Alexander said, his voice slicing through the cold air, you failed to establish reasonable suspicion for a traffic stop. You failed to establish probable cause for an arrest. You violated my Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. You assaulted me, applied excessive force, and deprived me of my liberty under the color of law, which is a federal crime under Title 18. U.S.C. Sanction, Section 242. Carter opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg, but no sound came out. I have your badge number. I have your cruiser's dashcam footage secured by default of your activation. Alexander continued, his tone devoid of any emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. I am going to get in my car now. And tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m. sharp, your captain, your chief of police, and the mayor will receive a federal civil rights lawsuit that will bankrupt your department, strip you of your pension, and ensure you never wear a badge or carry a firearm in this country ever again. Alexander turned to Sergeant Harrison, giving him a brief, curt nod. Have a good night, Sergeant. Without waiting for a response, Alexander walked back to his Lamborghini, picked his keys and phone off the hood, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the scissor door down. The V12 engine roared to life, shattering the silence, and the matte black car pulled smoothly back onto the road, leaving Officer Carter standing on the shoulder, staring at the ruins of his own life. The morning sun over Oak Brook brought no warmth to the precinct of the local police department. At 8:45 a.m., the squad room, usually a hub of loud banter and clinking coffee mugs, was suffocatingly silent. Every officer, detective, and administrative assistant was staring at their computer monitors, reading the same breaking news article from the Chicago Tribune. The headline was a digital guillotine. Federal judge assaulted in suburban traffic stop. Fills 10 mil won Charles civil rights lawsuit against city. Officer Bradley Carter sat at his metal desk in the corner, his eyes bloodshot, a half-empty cup of stale coffee trembling in his hand. He had barely slept. He had spent the entire night convincing himself that Sergeant Harrison had overreacted, that Judge Smith would cool off, and that the police union, the impenetrable shield that had protected him from 4 prior excessive force complaints, would step in and make this nightmare disappear. The blue wall of silence had always held firm. It was the unwritten rule of the badge. At 8:50 a.m., the heavy oak door to Captain Thomas O'Reilly's office violently slammed open. O'Reilly, a 30-year veteran with a notoriously short temper and a low tolerance for rogue cops, stood in the doorway. His face was the color of a bruised plum. Carter, Donovan. My office, now. O'Reilly roared, his voice cracking like a bullwhip across the silent squad room. Bill Donovan, the heavy-set, usually confident union representative, stood up from a nearby desk. He didn't look at Carter. He was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. Carter stood, his legs feeling like lead. As he walked across the room, he felt the stares of his colleagues. They weren't looks of sympathy. They were looks of sheer, unadulterated anger. Carter hadn't just endangered his own career. He had dragged the entire department into the crosshairs of the federal government. Carter and Donovan entered the captain's office. O'Reilly didn't tell them to sit. He marched behind his desk, leaning heavily on his knuckles, glaring at Carter with a disgust so profound it made the rookie physically recoil. Sitting in the corner of the office, flanked by 2 men in sharp, dark suits, was the chief of police, Robert Caldwell. Chief Caldwell looked like a man who had just been told his house was burning down. "Do you have any concept," Captain O'Reilly began, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "of the thermonuclear device that just detonated on my desk, Carter?" "Captain, shut your mouth." O'Reilly slammed his palm onto his desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "You don't speak unless spoken to." At 8 a.m. this morning, a courier arrived from the downtown offices of Kensington and Sterling, the most ruthless civil rights litigation firm in the Midwest. They delivered a 45-page federal complaint. "Not down at that factory golden domain, man." O'Reilly picked up a thick stack of legal paper bound in blue and hurled it across the desk. It hit Carter in the chest and scattered across the floor. $10 million, Carter. Chief Caldwell spoke up from the corner, his voice devoid of any warmth. That is what Judge Alexander Smith is suing the city for. But he didn't stop there. He is suing the department. He is suing Captain O'Reilly. And in a move that I have rarely seen in my 35 years of law enforcement, he is suing you, Officer Carter, in your personal, individual capacity. Donovan stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. Chief, Captain, let's not rush to judgment here. Officer Carter was operating under the assumption of a stolen vehicle. We have qualified immunity. The Union will. The Union will do absolutely nothing, Bill. O'Reilly snapped. He reached over and tapped a key on his computer keyboard. A flat-screen TV mounted on the walls sprang to life. It was the dashcam and bodycam footage from the night before. Crystal clear, high-definition video with perfectly synchronized audio. The room watched in silence as Carter's digital ghost bullied, threatened, and violently manhandled the federal judge. They heard the judge calmly state his rights, and they heard Carter mock him. They watched Carter forcefully rip a 58-year-old man out of a legally owned vehicle and wrench his arms behind his back. Where is the probable cause, Carter? O'Reilly demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. Where is the erratic driving? Where is the combative behavior you called in to dispatch? You fabricated the entire stop because a black man was driving a car you decided he couldn't afford. You didn't just break protocol, you shattered it on camera. Carter felt a cold sweat dripping down his spine. Captain, the holding company. It looked suspicious. The holding company is a standard asset protection trust, you absolute moron, O'Reilly sneered. It takes a single phone call to the Secretary of State's office to verify it. You didn't make that call. You made an assumption. And that assumption has now triggered a federal investigation. Chief Caldwell stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. It gets worse. Judge Smith didn't just file a civil suit. He personally contacted the Department of Justice. As of an hour ago, the FBI's Civil Rights Division is opening an investigation into this department. They are subpoenaing your entire service record, Carter, including the 4 complaints that Donovan here managed to bury. Donovan's face went completely pale. Chief, those records are sealed under union arbitration. Not anymore, Caldwell said coldly. A federal subpoena pierces union arbitration, Bill. You know that. The DOJ is going to look at a pattern of racially motivated stops, and they are going to use Carter as the poster boy for police reform in this state. Caldwell turned his full attention to Carter. The look in the chief's eyes was the look of a man cutting off a gangrenous limb to save the body. Officer Carter, you are hereby stripped of your police powers, Caldwell ordered. Place your badge, your service weapon, your taser, and your ID card on the captain's desk. Immediately. Chief, please, Carter pleaded, his voice breaking. I have a mortgage. I'm getting married next year. If you suspend me without pay, you're not suspended without pay, Caldwell interrupted. You are terminated, effective immediately. Captain O'Reilly has already signed the paperwork. Your actions represent a gross, willful violation of department policy and constitutional law. You are a liability that this city cannot afford. Carter stood paralyzed. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in. He looked at Donovan, desperately seeking a lifeline. Donovan looked away, refusing to meet Carter's eyes. Bradley, the Union Charter has a clause. If an officer is found to have acted with explicit malice and entirely outside the scope of their duties, the Union is not legally obligated to provide legal counsel for personal civil liability. What? Carter gasped, the air completely leaving his lungs. You're abandoning me? We have to protect the collective bargaining agreement, Donovan muttered, looking at the floor. The optics on this, we can't defend you. You're on your own. Badge. Gun. Now, O'Reilly barked. With trembling, numb fingers, Carter unclipped his gold shield and placed it on the wooden desk. He unholstered his Glock 19, cleared the chamber, and set it down next to the badge. In less than 12 hours, he had gone from a man wielding unquestioned authority to an unemployed civilian facing financial ruin and federal prison time. 6 months later, the swagger was completely gone from Bradley Carter. He sat in a stark, heavily air-conditioned conference room on the 42nd floor of a towering downtown Chicago law firm. He was wearing an ill-fitting suit he had bought at a discount store. His tailored clothes had been sold months ago to cover rent. He had lost 20 pounds. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his hands possessed a permanent, nervous tremor. Across the long mahogany table sat Sarah Kensington. She was the managing partner of Kensington & Sterling, a woman whose reputation in civil rights litigation was so terrifying that city municipalities often settled cases just to avoid being cross-examined by her. She wore a pristine white suit, her expression totally unreadable as she arranged a stack of documents in front of her. Sitting silently beside Kensington was Alexander Smith. The judge wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his posture immaculate. He did not look at Carter with anger or malice. He looked at him with the cold, analytical detachment of an entomologist studying a particularly unpleasant insect pinned to a board. Carter's own lawyer, a public defender named Greg Miller, whom Carter had scraped the bottom of his savings to retain on a flat fee, looked visibly intimidated just being in the same room as Kensington and Smith. A court reporter sat at the end of the table, her fingers poised over the stenograph machine. "Mr. Carter," Kensington began, her voice smooth but laced with razor wire, "let us review the events of October 14th. You have stated under oath that you believed the 2024 Lamborghini Revuelto driven by my client was stolen. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Carter muttered, his throat dry. "Please speak up for the court reporter, Mr. Carter." "Yes," Carter said louder. Kensington pulled a document from her stack and slid it across the table. "This is the dispatch log from that evening. At 10:12 p.m., dispatch informed you that the vehicle was registered to Smith Holdings, LLC, that it had no wants or warrants, and that it was legally insured. Did you hear that transmission?" Yes, I heard it. So, the state database explicitly told you the car was legally registered and not reported stolen. Yet 2 minutes later, you initiated a high-risk traffic stop. What exactly changed in those 2 minutes, Mr. Carter? "I believed the holding company was a front." Carter recited the defense he and Miller had desperately cobbled together. "It's a common tactic for organized crime." Kensington smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "Organized crime. I see. Mr. Carter, did you run a background check on Smith Holdings, LLC prior to activating your lights?" "No, there wasn't time." "Did you observe the vehicle violating any traffic laws? Speeding? Swerving?" "No." Kensington leaned forward, interlacing her fingers. "Then what exactly was your probable cause to forcibly extract my client from his vehicle and place him in handcuffs?" Carter swallowed hard. He looked at Miller, who gave a slight, helpless shrug. I relied on my training and experience. The totality of the circumstances." "The totality of the circumstances," Kensington repeated softly. She pulled out a thicker folder. This one had a red seal. "Let's talk about your training and experience, Mr. Carter. Exhibit C for the record. This is a subpoenaed internal affairs file from your former department." Carter's heart dropped into his stomach. 3 years ago, you pulled over a Hispanic male driving a brand-new Mercedes-Benz. You cited suspicious behavior. The mud was the cardiovascular surgeon at Northwestern Memorial. 2 years ago, you forcibly detained a black female driving a Range Rover. You claimed you smelled marijuana. No drugs were found. She was a senior vice president at Chase Bank. Kensington read the files meticulously, the words hitting Carter like physical blows. 4 complaints, 4 instances of you pulling over affluent minorities in high-end vehicles without a shred of legal justification. Kensington dropped the file onto the table. "Your training and experience, Mr. Carter, appears to be nothing more than a profound, deeply ingrained racial prejudice coupled with a badge." "The muck." "Objection," Miller squeaked out weakly. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Noted for the record," Kensington replied, barely looking at Miller. She turned her piercing gaze back to Carter. "Mr. Carter, are you aware that the Department of Justice is currently finalizing a criminal indictment against you for deprivation of rights under color of law?" Carter closed his eyes. The room was spinning. I have been informed of the investigation. Are you also aware that my client has instructed this firm to reject any and all settlement offers from the city?" Carter's eyes snapped open. He looked at Judge Smith. The judge simply nodded once. "We are taking this to a jury trial in federal court," Kensington stated, her voice echoing in the silent room. "The city's insurance will cover the department's liability. But because you acted outside the scope of your duties, you are personally indemnified. If the jury awards the $10 million and given this evidence, you will be personally responsible for your portion of the judgment. Every paycheck you earn, every asset you own, your bank accounts, your car, your future earnings, they will all be garnished for the rest of your natural life." Carter felt a physical sickness rise in his throat. It was absolute, unmitigated ruin. His fiancée, Jessica, had packed her bags and left him 2 months ago when reporters started camping on their lawn. He had been working overnight shifts as a security guard at a dilapidated warehouse just to buy groceries. He had nothing left, and now they were going to ensure he never had anything ever again. "Why?" Carter whispered, his voice cracking, looking directly at Judge Smith for the first time. "I lost my job. I lost my fiancée. I'm going to prison. Isn't that enough? Why are you destroying my entire life?" Judge Smith finally broke his silence. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. "Mr. Carter," Smith said, his deep baritone carrying the immense weight of the courtroom, "you did not just disrespect a man. You disrespected the fundamental concept of liberty. You used the power entrusted to you by the public to terrorize a citizen based on your own bigotry. You believe that your badge gave you the right to be judge, jury, and executioner on the shoulder of a suburban highway. Nuts. Cough. Smith's eyes were like chips of flint. "For decades, men like you have hidden behind unions and qualified immunity, destroying lives without consequence. You asked why I am doing this. I am doing this because I can. I am doing this to ensure that every racist, power-hungry rookie cop in the state of Illinois looks at what happened to Bradley Carter and thinks twice before they illegally rip a man out of his car." Smith stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "We are done here, Sarah. See you in court, Mr. Carter." As Judge Smith and his attorney walked out of the conference room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them, Bradley Carter buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep. The sound echoed in the empty room, a hollow, pathetic noise of a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings of arrogance and was now tumbling endlessly into the abyss. 14 months after the red and blue lights illuminated that matte black Lamborghini, the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois was a fortress of tense, suffocating anticipation. The civil trial of Alexander J. Smith v. Bradley Carter had become a national media circus. News vans lined Dearborn Street, and the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Eleanor Higgins was packed to absolute capacity. Reporters, civil rights activists, and off-duty police officers crammed into the varnish oak pews, separated by a heavy wooden partition from the arena where Bradley Carter life was being systematically dismantled. Carter sat at the defense table, practically shrinking into his ill-fitting tan suit. The arrogance that had once defined him was entirely eroded, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. Beside him, his overwhelmed public defender, Greg Miller, furiously rubbed his temples, already resigning himself to the catastrophic defeat looming on the horizon. At the plaintiff's table sat Alexander Smith. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, his posture perfectly rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic authority. Beside him, Sarah Kensington, his lead counsel, moved with the precision of an apex predator circling a wounded animal. The trial had been a 3-day slaughter. Kensington hadn't just relied on the dashcam footage, which was damning enough. She had orchestrated a masterful, devastating presentation of Carter's entire career history. The city of Oak Brook, terrified by the impending DOJ investigation, had already reached a separate sealed multi-million-dollar settlement with Smith, completely severing ties with Carter and leaving the disgraced officer to face the punitive damages entirely alone. "The plaintiff calls Dr. Hector Ramirez to the stand," Kensington announced, her voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous courtroom. A distinguished, gray-haired man in a tailored suit walked past the wooden partition and took the oath. Dr. Ramirez was the chief of cardiovascular surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. "Dr. Ramirez," Kensington began, pacing slowly before the jury box, "could you please tell the court about your encounter with Mr. Carter 3 years ago?" "I was driving home from a 16-hour surgical rotation, Doctor," Ramirez said, his voice trembling slightly with remembered indignity. "I drive the Mercedes S-Class. Officer Carter pulled me over, claiming I swerved. I had not. He demanded to know if I had stolen the vehicle, accused me of running drugs, and kept me handcuffed on the side of the interstate for 2 hours while he illegally searched my trunk." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The jury, a diverse cross-section of Chicagoans, stared at Carter with mounting disgust. "Did you file a formal complaint, Doctor?" Kensington asked. "I did, but 2 weeks later, a union representative named Bill Donovan visited my office. He heavily implied that pursuing the complaint could result in heightened scrutiny of my medical license by the state board. I was intimidated, so I dropped it." Kensington nodded grimly. "Thank you, Doctor." No further questions. Miller didn't even attempt a cross-examination. There was nothing he could say. The hits kept coming. Kensington called Chloe Sterling, a senior vice president at Chase Bank, who tearfully recounted how Carter had drawn his service weapon on her during a bogus traffic stop because she, a black woman, was driving a new Range Rover. She too had been intimidated into silence by the police union. The narrative was no longer about a single mistake made on a cold October night. Kensington was painting a horrifying masterpiece of systemic weaponized racism, with Bradley Carter as the brush. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Greg Miller made a desperate, agonizing decision. He called Carter to the stand. It was a Hail Mary pass, an attempt to humanize the man, to beg the jury for mercy by showing his absolute ruin. Carter took the stand, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edges of the wooden enclosure to steady himself. Under Miller's gentle questioning, Carter cried. He spoke about his ruined engagement, his lost pension, his inability to find anything but minimum-wage graveyard shifts. He looked at the jury and sobbed, apologizing for his lapse in judgment. Then it was Sarah Kensington's turn. She did not yell. She walked slowly to the podium, placing a single sheet of paper down. She looked at Carter with eyes so cold they could freeze nitrogen. "Mr. Carter," Kensington said softly, "you just told this jury that you suffered a lapse in judgment. Do I have that right?" "Yes," Carter choked out, wiping his eyes with the tissue. "A lapse in judgment is forgetting to use your turn signal. A lapse in judgment is misreading a radar gun," Kensington said, her voice slowly rising in volume. "But let us be very clear about what you did. You targeted an innocent man. You ignored explicit police dispatch data confirming his innocence. You physically assaulted a 58-year-old citizen, deprived him of his constitutional rights, and fabricated a felony charge because his skin color did not match your prejudiced assessment of his bank account. Was that a lapse in judgment, or was that a deliberate malicious abuse of state power?" I was scared. I was scared," Carter stammered. "Scared of what, Mr. Carter?" Kensington snapped, slamming her hand on the podium. "Scared of a man in sweatpants driving the speed limit, or were you angry that a black man had achieved a level of success that you fundamentally believed he did not deserve?" "Objection," Badgering, badgering. Miller shouted, jumping to his feet. Overruled, Judge Higgins said sharply, not taking her eyes off Carter. The witness will answer the question. I didn't know he was a judge, Carter whispered weakly, his head dropping. The courtroom went dead silent. It was the worst possible thing he could have said. Alexander Smith leaned back in his chair, a grim, satisfied shadow crossing his face. Kensington stepped back from the podium, letting the horrific implication of Carter's words hang in the air for 10 agonizing seconds. You didn't know he was a judge, Kensington repeated, her voice dripping with absolute venom. So if he had just been a mechanic, or a school teacher, or a janitor, your behavior would have been perfectly acceptable? Carter realized his catastrophic error, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. No, that's not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant, Kensington cut him off. You believed that because you had a badge and because you assumed he was a nobody, you could terrorize him without consequence. You only regret your actions because, for the first time in your life, you picked on someone who could fight back. She turned to the jury, locking eyes with the foreman. No further questions, Your Honor. Carter was excused from the stand, practically collapsing back into his chair. The defense rested. There was nothing left to say. The trial was over, and everyone in the room knew it. The only question remaining was the price tag of Bradley Carter's arrogance. The jury deliberation took less than 4 hours. When the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carter stood beside his lawyer, his eyes squeezed shut, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. Across the aisle, Alexander Smith stood tall, his hands clasped neatly behind his back, projecting an aura of absolute inevitability. Judge Higgins took the bench and looked out over the packed room. As the jury reached a verdict, the jury foreman, a middle-aged woman in a grey cardigan, stood up. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. The foreman unfolded the paper. Her voice was steady, projecting clearly across the silent gallery. In the civil matter of Alexander J. Smith versus Bradley Carter, on the charge of unlawful search and seizure, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the charge of false imprisonment, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the charge of battery under the color of law, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Carter let out a shaky, desperate breath, but the worst was yet to come. Regarding compensatory damages, the foreman continued, the jury awards the plaintiff $2 million. The gasp rippled through the reporters. $2 million would bankrupt Carter instantly. But Kensington had demanded 10. Regarding punitive damages, the foreman's voice grew harder, her eyes flicking toward Carter to serve as a deterrent against future egregious abuses of authority. The jury awards the plaintiff $8 million. Total damages assessed against the defendant personally, $10 million. The gavel slammed down, but the sound was drowned out by the eruption of noise from the gallery. Carter's knees finally gave out. He collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his arms, weeping uncontrollably. It was over. He was 32 years old, and he was staring down a $10 million judgment that could not be discharged in bankruptcy due to the malicious nature of the tort. He would spend the rest of his life turning over every penny he earned to the man he had assaulted. But the universe and Alexander Smith were not quite finished dispensing karma. 2 weeks after the civil verdict, the Department of Justice officially unsealed their criminal indictment. Bradley Carter was arrested by federal agents at his tiny rented apartment. He was charged with 3 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony. The DOJ used the civil trial transcript, the dash cam footage, and the testimonies of Dr. Tu, Ramirez and Chloe Sterling to build an insurmountable case. Facing a potential 20-year sentence, Carter's new court-appointed lawyer brokered a desperate plea deal. Carter pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to 60 months, 5 full years in the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. The Oak Brook Police Department did not escape the blast radius. The DOJ's investigation revealed a systemic pattern of racial profiling and union-led witness intimidation. The department was placed under a strict federal consent decree. Captain O'Reilly was forced into early retirement. Bill Donovan, the union representative who had covered for Carter, was indicted on federal obstruction of justice charges. The blue wall of silence in Oak Brook had been violently, publicly pulverized. As for Alexander Smith, he returned to his chambers on the 44th floor of the federal building, donning his heavy black robes, a titan of the law once more. When the first garnishment checks from Carter's seized bank accounts began to arrive, Alexander did not keep a single cent. He had never cared about the money. He cared about the message. Alexander took the initial funds, combined them with the massive settlement he had extracted from the city, and established the Smith Civil Rights Initiative. The foundation provided free, elite legal representation spearheaded by Sarah Kensington's firm to minority citizens who had been victims of police brutality, wrongful arrest, and excessive force. The foundation's mandate was simple: to ensure that no corrupt officer could ever again hide behind their badge or their union. 3 years later, on a crisp autumn evening, Chief Judge Alexander Smith left the courthouse after a grueling week of corporate litigation. He shed his suit jacket, pulling a comfortable gray Yale hoodie over his head. He walked down into the secure subterranean parking garage, his footsteps echoing in the quiet concrete cavern. He approached the pristine matte black 2024 Lamborghini Revuelto. He pressed the key fob, and the heavy scissor doors glided upward. Alexander slid into the low-slung bucket seat, gripping the Alcantara steering wheel. He pressed the ignition button, and the naturally aspirated V12 engine roared to life, a magnificent guttural symphony of power. Alexander pulled the supercar out of the garage and onto the streets of Chicago. He drove precisely the speed limit. As he merged onto the highway, heading toward the affluent, heavily manicured streets of the suburbs, a police cruiser passed him in the opposite direction. Alexander didn't tense up, he didn't grip the wheel tighter, he just kept driving, the deep purr of the engine a soothing hum in the night. The cop in the cruiser didn't even slow down. The balance had shifted. The line had been drawn, etched into the legal bedrock of the city with a $10 million pen. Justice had not just been served, it had been weaponized for the greater good. And Alexander Smith, the black man in the hoodie, drove his Lamborghini into the night, completely, undeniably untouchable. If this story of absolute karma and the triumph of justice over arrogance kept you on the edge of your seat, we need you to help spread the word. These real-life legal dramas show us that absolute power doesn't always win, and that sometimes the bullies pick on the exact wrong person. Hit that like button right now to show your support for Judge Smith's legendary takedown of a corrupt system. Plus, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into the most jaw-dropping, satisfying revenge stories and legal battles in history. What did you think of Sarah Kensington's brutal courtroom destruction of Officer Carter? Did he get exactly what he deserved? Or was a $10 million judgment in federal prison too harsh? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your take. Share this video with someone who loves a good dose of instant karma, and we'll see you in the next one.